Finding upper and lower bounds with Adam Maths Tutor. Here are the beginner questions, some of the easiest questions that you're likely to find on this topic. 76 has been rounded to the nearest integer. State its lower and upper bounds. When a value is rounded, it could represent any number within a range. The upper bound is the biggest actual value the number can be and still be rounded down to give the number in the question. Take 76, for example. This number has been rounded to the nearest integer, meaning it's been rounded to the units column. Our rounding line in the original number would have gone after the units column. Identifying where the rounding line goes is the quickest way to help us answer the question. For the upper bound, you can just put a 5 in the next place value column to the right, meaning the upper bound would be 76.5. The actual value is strictly less than the upper bound, because if it was equal to the upper bound, it would actually round up to the next unit. The lower bound is the smallest actual value the number can take and still be rounded up to the number in the question. And we can quickly work this out by putting a 5 in the next place value column to the right, but remembering to take away 1 from the number before the rounding line, turning 76 into 75. A quick way of checking whether your answers are likely to be correct is to look at the difference between the upper and lower bound. In this case, the difference is 1, and this difference should be the same as what you're rounding to, which is the nearest integer. And another way of rounding to the nearest integer is rounding to the nearest 1. 220 has been rounded to the nearest tens. These are my units, tens, hundreds, meaning my rounding line needs to go after the tens column. The upper bound will be 225 if I put a 5 after the rounding line, and the lower bound would be a 5 after the rounding line, but remembering to take away 1 from the number before it, so it would be 21 rather than 22. Checking my answer by looking at the difference between these two, which is 10, and this is the same as what I rounded to, which was to the nearest 10. 550 has been rounded to the nearest 50. This type of question is slightly different. It is more uncommon and not frequently asked in exams, but could technically still come up. Rounding to the nearest 50 doesn't appear in our place value grid, so using the rounding line to put a 5 afterwards won't work. An alternative method is to take the number that you've rounded to, which is 50, and half this to give us 25. Since we know the difference between the upper and lower bound is always equal to the number you've rounded to, such as 10 for the question previously, when you half the number you've rounded to give us 25, we can add this on to the upper bound to give us 575 and subtract to give us the lower bound, 525. You can see in the same way that we checked before, the difference between these two numbers is 50, which is the same as what was rounded to for the original number. On to the intermediate questions. With a slight increase in difficulty, we're now going from rounding to whole numbers to rounding to decimal places. We will continue to use the same method since decimal places do appear on our place value grid. 7.6 has been rounded to 1 decimal place. We'll put our rounding line after the first decimal place, which is here. For the upper bound, we can put a 5 in the next place value column to the right after the rounding line, 7.65, and we can do the same for the lower bound, but remember to take away 1 from the number before the rounding line, 7.55. 12.55 has been rounded to 2 decimal places, meaning the rounding line goes after the 5 in the second decimal place. The upper bound will be 12.55 and then a 5 after the rounding line, and the lower bound will be 12.5, and we can put a 5 after the rounding line, but remember to take away 1 from the number before it. 0.333 has been rounded to 3 decimal places. The rounding line, when rounding to decimal places, will always go at the end, in this case after the third decimal place, and the upper bound will be 0.3335, and the lower bound will be 0.33 and then 25. On to the advanced questions, some of the trickier questions that you're likely to find on this topic. These involve numbers that have been rounded to significant figures. These are often the trickier ones because it's a little bit more difficult to identify where the rounding line has gone in the original number. Starting off with 50 and rounding to one significant figure. The first significant figure or important digit is the 5, meaning my rounding line needs to go after this number. Now I've identified correctly where the rounding line goes, I can find the upper bound by putting a 5 after the rounding line to give me 55, and the lower bound I can put a 5 after the rounding line, but remember to take away 1 from the number before it. In this case, rounding to one significant figure would be the same as rounding to the nearest 10, and that's because the 5, which is the first significant figure, is in the tens column. Next, we're rounding 0.3 to one significant figure. Any number that's been rounded to give you a decimal would always have the rounding line at the end, but in this case you can also see how that's after the first significant figure. The 0 at the beginning is not a significant figure, so our first significant figure would be the 3, meaning that the rounding line has to go after that. The upper bound, 0.3 and then a 5 after the rounding line, and the lower bound is a 5 after the rounding line, but take away 1 from the number before it, 0.25. Lastly, 5,400 has been rounded to two significant figures. The second significant figure will be the 4, so I put my rounding line afterwards, meaning the upper bound would be 5,450 and the lower bound would be 5,350. Here's a question that I've already completed. It appears as though I've made some mistakes. Pause the video, let's see if you can spot what they are, and tell me in the comments below. Thanks for watching. If you found that video useful, don't forget to hit the like button and leave a comment. If you're struggling with topics or finding maths difficult, subscribe and turn on notifications to receive regular updates about new video tutorials and other useful content. You can visit and follow all of my socials by clicking the links in the description below.